The courtroom was suffocating, filled with the stench of sweat and the sound of sharpened lies. Jesus stood in the center of a storm, surrounded by powerful men who were screaming accusations, fabricating crimes, and spitting on his character. The high priest was pacing, desperate for a reaction, practically begging for an argument. Pilate, the Roman governor, looked at him with confusion, asking, "Don't you hear how many things they are testifying against you?" But Jesus did something that terrified them more than a 1,000-man army. He said absolutely nothing. He didn't offer a defense, he didn't point out the logical fallacies of his accusers, and he didn't beg for mercy. He stood there with a terrifying stillness, his eyes reflecting a reality they couldn't touch. His silence wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a silence of power. He knew that his destiny was already written, and that the words of these small, panicked men were beneath the dignity of his mission. In the jungle of high-level business and social competition, your reaction is your price tag. The moment you begin to frantically explain yourself to people who are determined to hate you, you have effectively lowered your value to their level. Weak people are obsessed with proving their worth, correcting the record, and winning every petty argument on social media or in the office. They are slaves to the opinions of others. But a true leader understands that silence is the ultimate dimensional attack. When someone tries to provoke you with insults or false accusations, they are trying to steal your energy and pull you into their messy, low-vibe script. By remaining silent, you refuse the bait. You show the world that your internal peace is not for sale. You let the results of your work do the talking, knowing that a lion never turns around when a small dog barks. Your silence is a thunderous statement that you are operating on a frequency that their noise cannot reach. Save your breath for your vision. Give your enemies nothing but the vacuum of your indifference. The atmosphere was electric with the fever of revolution. After seeing the miracles and the power Jesus possessed, the massive crowd reached a consensus. They wanted to seize him and make him king by force. This was the ultimate opportunity. Most men spend their entire lives chasing exactly this: the crown, the throne, the public adoration, and the peak of social status. To the disciples and the onlookers, this was the moment of arrival. But Jesus looked at the crowd, sensed their desperate, shallow expectations, and did something shocking. He didn't give a speech, he didn't accept the crown, and he didn't negotiate. He simply turned his back on the throne and walked alone into the dark, rugged mountains to pray. He refused to play the role that the public had written for him. He understood that their crown was actually a cage, and their loyalty was just a demand for him to satisfy their political whims. He chose the mountain of solitude over the palace of puppets. Most people live their lives trapped in other people's scripts. They spend their best years trying to satisfy their parents' expectations, their friends' definitions of success, or society's demand to scale up and go bigger. They are terrified of being seen as a failure or an outsider, so they keep climbing a ladder that is leaning against the wrong wall. True sovereignty is the audacity to walk away from a promotion that would cost you your soul. It is the power to say no to a crown if that crown doesn't fit your mission. You are not a circus animal trained to perform for the applause of the crowd. If the world thinks you should be leveling up, but your gut tells you that the path leads to a trap, you must have the courage to disappear into your own mountain. Your life is not a democracy. You don't need a majority vote to decide your direction. The greatest freedom you will ever possess is the right to be misunderstood by people who don't share your vision. Stop trying to win a game you never wanted to play. Jesus entered the temple, the most sacred place in the city, and found it crawling with corruption. It wasn't a place of peace. It was a loud, chaotic market where money changers were exploiting the poor and turning prayer into a profit margin. He didn't walk in and try to have a civil dialogue with the corruption. He didn't try to bridge the gap with the thieves. He braided a whip of cords, his eyes burning with a focused, terrifying intensity, and he began to flip the heavy tables. Coins flew, birds escaped, and the merchants fled in a panic. But here is the secret. He didn't lose his mind. He wasn't out of control. This wasn't a temper tantrum, it was a strategic strike. He used his anger like a surgical laser to cut out a tumor. Minutes later, the atmosphere changed completely. The noise was gone, the greed was cleared out, and the temple was finally quiet enough for him to sit down and teach the people. He could be a storm when necessary and a calm sea the next moment. He owned his anger. His anger did not own him. There is a massive difference between a bomb and a laser. A bomb is a person who loses their temper at every minor inconvenience: the traffic, the waiter, the coworker. They are slaves to their adrenaline, and their anger is just a sign that they have lost control of themselves. But a laser is a person of high emotional sovereignty who uses anger as a tool for cleaning house. True strength is not about being nice all the time, it is about knowing exactly when to flip the table. There are moments in business and in life where a polite conversation will not work. There are moments when you must draw a hard line in the sand and let the world know that you will not be exploited. This is not about being emotional, it is about being intentional. When you use anger strategically, you do it to protect your mission, enforce your boundaries, and clear out the money changes in your life. And the true test of this power is how quickly you can return to a state of calm once the table has been flipped. If you can't control your fire, you will burn your own house down. But if you can focus it, you can change the world. The crowds were relentless. Thousands of people were pressing in, shouting their needs, pulling at his clothes and demanding miracles. His schedule was overflowing with the broken, the sick, and the curious. To any modern hustler, this was the peak of influence: a massive following, constant engagement, and a calendar booked months in advance. But in the middle of this absolute peak of activity, Jesus would suddenly vanish. He didn't check with his disciples, and he didn't schedule a wrap-up meeting. He simply walked away from the noise, the applause, and the demands, and retreated deep into the desolate wilderness. He sought out the places where there was nothing but rocks, wind, and silence. He stayed there for hours, sometimes days, with no audience and no distractions. He wasn't lonely, he was recharging. He understood that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and you cannot hear the voice of your mission if you are constantly listening to the chatter of the marketplace. The world is terrified of being alone. We have turned our phones into digital pacifiers because the thought of being alone with our own minds for 10 minutes is unbearable. If you cannot survive without a notification, a like, or a conversation, you are not a leader, you are a captive. Constant social interaction is a massive drain on your creative and emotional battery. It forces you to perform and react rather than create and initiate. Real power is found in the wilderness reset. It is the ability to walk away from the digital noise and the social treadmill to confront the silence. If you are bored when you are alone, it is a sign that you are internally bankrupt. The strongest people in history are those who possess a solitary fortress, a mental space where they can disconnect from the opinions of the world to recalibrate their internal compass. In an age of infinite information, the ultimate luxury and the ultimate weapon is a quiet mind. Stop being afraid of the wilderness. If you don't learn how to disappear periodically, you will eventually burn out and become a hollow version of yourself. True energy is generated in the dark, away from the stage. The scene was a masterpiece of human cruelty. Jesus was nailed to a cross, his body broken and his dignity stripped. Below him, the very people who had just cheered for his execution were mocking him, throwing insults and gambling for his clothes. The Roman soldiers were indifferent, and the religious leaders were gloating over their victory. He was in the middle of the ultimate betrayal and the ultimate physical agony. Any normal human response would have been a scream for vengeance, a curse on his enemies, or a vow of eternal hatred. But Jesus looked down at the men who were actively killing him and said something that defied all human logic. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." He wasn't asking for an apology, and he wasn't waiting for them to realize their mistake. He offered forgiveness while the nails were still in his wrists. He chose to release the debt before the debt was even acknowledged. Forgiveness is not a kindness you do for the other person, it is a ruthless efficiency you do for yourself. When you hold onto a grudge, you are essentially letting a bad actor live rent-free in your brain. You are allocating your mental CPU and your emotional bandwidth to a person who has already harmed you. To hate someone is to be perpetually tethered to them. You think you are punishing them with your anger, but you are the only one drinking the poison. True forgiveness logic is about total, emotional divestment. It is the realization that your mission is too big to be stalled by a petty resentment. You forgive because you don't have the time or the energy to carry the weight of a dead person's mistakes. You cut the cord so you can fly higher. If you are waiting for an "I'm sorry" to move on, you have handed the keys to your happiness to your enemy. Forgive them because they are ignorant of the bigger picture. But mostly forgive them because you have better things to do with your life than be a museum of past hurts. Release the ghost and take back your power. The night was collapsing into a nightmare of desertion. Only hours before, Jesus had been surrounded by a loyal inner circle, men who had sworn they would die for him, men who had shared his bread and witnessed his power. But as the torches of the temple guard flickered in the distance and the chains rattled, the loyalty evaporated like mist. One by one, they vanished into the shadows. His most vocal supporter denied even knowing his name, not once but 3 times, just to save his own skin. By the time the trial began, the man who had commanded crowds was standing entirely alone. There was no cheering section, no legal defense, and no friendly faces in the gallery. Yet, he didn't collapse into despair. He didn't scream about the unfairness of the betrayal or beg his friends to come back. He stood with a terrifying, quiet composure. He walked toward the judgment seat with the same steady pace he had used when he was a hero. His anchor wasn't tied to the fickle hearts of men. It was buried deep in a mission that existed before they arrived, and would remain after they were gone. If your sense of worth is tied to the likes, the shares, or the loyalty of your social circle, you are building your house on a sinking sandbar. People are inherently volatile, their moods shift with the wind, and their loyalty often ends where their convenience begins. If you are a tree, whose roots are tied to a passing car, the opinions of your peers or the praise of your boss, you will be uprooted and dragged through the dirt the moment that car decides to drive away. Real anchor logic is the realization that your internal stability must be independent of your external environment. You must have a deep root that goes into the bedrock of your own principles, your own work ethic, and your own long-term vision. When the crowd leaves, and eventually they always do, a true leader is the one who doesn't change their pace. You don't need a standing ovation to know you are doing the right thing. Stop looking for validation from people who are just as lost as you are. Find your own ground, sink your roots deep, and stay standing when the winds of betrayal blow. A man who can stand alone is the only one who is truly fit to lead. In the middle of a profound teaching session, a man interrupted the flow with a desperate personal grievance. "Master," he shouted, "tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." It was a classic family dispute: money, fairness, and legal bickering over a dead man's estate. The man clearly expected Jesus to take a side, to be the good guy, and to use his authority to settle a petty domestic squabble. It was a rescue opportunity that most people would have jumped into just to feel important or helpful. But Jesus didn't even pause to hear the details of the lawsuit. He looked at the man with a cold, piercing clarity and asked, "Who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" He wasn't being lazy, he was being disciplined. He refused to let his high-level energy be sucked into a low-level drama that had nothing to do with his primary mission. He shut down the logic of the trivial before it could take a single bite out of his focus. He simply said no and went back to his work. The fastest way to fail is to try to solve everyone else's problems. Your life is being bled dry by 1,000 small requests, family dramas, and urgent favors that have absolutely nothing to do with your ultimate goals. People will constantly try to appoint you as the judge of their messes because they want to offload their responsibility onto your shoulders. If you lack a focus firewall, you will spend your entire life being a fixer for other people's lack of discipline, while your own empire falls into ruin. Sovereignty is the cold, hard ability to say, "That is not my problem." It isn't cruelty, it is stewardship. Your attention is the most expensive currency you possess, and you are currently spending it on pennies. You must learn to distinguish between a mission and a distraction. If a situation doesn't align with the architecture of your life, you have no obligation to fix it, judge it, or even acknowledge it. Let people handle their own inheritances and their own messes. You have a world to build and a destiny to execute. Close the gate, turn up the silence, and get back to your own table.